All right, great. Well, welcome to the event, and thanks for joining us, Dr. Zelin and Dr. Sarkin. I was wondering if, Ophelia, are you going to make any opening remarks, or do you want me to just jump right into the event? Okay, I'll jump into it. All right, great. So I'd like to thank the Václac Havel Center for organizing this event, and to our distinguished guests for joining us, Dr. Zelin and Dr. Sarkin. Obviously, a lot has happened in Syria over the last several months at a very quick pace, and we're trying to keep apprised of all these events as they happen very quickly. We're joined today by these two experts. And before we jump into the questions, the Q&A session, I wanted to give them a few minutes to introduce themselves, and to even offer maybe some introductory remarks about the situation in Syria, and then we can jump into more specific questions about what's occurring there. Dr. Sarkin, would you like to introduce yourself first and maybe give a few remarks about the situation in Syria, and then we'll move to Dr. Zelin?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for organizing the event and for inviting me. Firstly, in terms of my background, South African, which obviously has a lot to do with what I think about things, but also having worked in many countries in transitions, on transitional justice, played a large role in developing the South African Constitution, and that's some of the issues I want to talk about today as well, but also was very involved in the South African Truth Commission. But I've been involved in many other truth commissions and transitional justice processes around the world. There's a lot I could say. I write about these issues. I provide assistance to the UN. I worked on the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances for 6 years, spending 3 as the chair of the organization. Work extensively on missing persons, and just published a whole series of articles about missing persons in the South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. For those of you who don't know, I did a large study in 2021 called Humans Not Numbers, which I was asked to write by 5 Syrian organizations who were committed to having the international community deal with their relatives who had disappeared into the morass of the Syrian detention centers. And I wrote that report, then wrote a book, and with the Truth and Justice Charter Group, we advocated for the UN to set up a process, which the General Assembly then created in 2023, and the process is now unfolding. So this is a key part of what I've been doing over the last couple of years. But specifically, my work on Syria has really been very much involved since 2009. 2009, I did a training program for Freedom House, training people specifically on documenting enforced disappearances and arbitrary detentions. Did a lot of work with No Peace Without Justice, training people in many occasions, particularly on constitution building, constitutional design. So that's my kind of background specifically. But certainly let me say that Syria has hit an interesting point at a time when most people 6 months ago thought that this would be a deadlocked situation for years. But we can say that political transitions are tumultuous. They're deeply conflict-ridden, they are lengthy processes, and are specifically war-shattered states that are ill-equipped really to deal with these particular problems. And it's institutional and political incoherences which are particularly problematic. And how do we find resolutions to those particular matters? So certainly in the broad sense, without specifically focusing yet on Syria, rebuilding the capacity of the state is a key issue. At the same time, building notions of order and security. How does one ensure demobilization, at the same time ensuring that non-state actors and other parties who could commit violence don't do that? How does one reduce the structural incentives to commit violence? And therefore, for me, some of the issues which are really key is, well, how do we go about understanding what is state building? What is nation building? How do we develop the political and social institutions of a society? And how do we do it in an inclusive way? Because one of the biggest problems is the possibility of recurring violence. And certainly, Syria has a long history of violence and conflict. So, setting up a process which is particularly important in terms of peace building, bringing groups together and understanding that ways of ensuring that people don't break out of the process, but continue to ensure that the process is beneficial to them is particularly important. So state building is one part, but the second part is nation building. How does one get people in all the different groups to buy into a Syria which is for them, that they don't feel that conflict has to continue, that they can trust the system, that they can see the system as particularly important in terms of protecting them? And certainly that's been a major problem in the past as far as those issues are concerned. So setting up a system in terms of a transitional arrangement, and then a constitution with various aspects, and we can go into those depending on the questions. How do we ensure that people buy into the process and believe the process is particularly important? We can learn lessons where things have gone wrong in a range of other countries, where people did not see the process as unrolling in a way which protected them. So critically, we need to think about, and some of the things we've seen over the last 2 months or so show some positive signs, but also some negative signs. We've seen a national dialogue process, which was really unrolled in quite a problematic way. And how do we ensure that the process unfolds in a way which ensures that people believe that they can accept the process and the process is theirs particularly? So there are a lot of things we could talk about in terms of the national dialogue process, because those are particularly key. How do we build tolerance, trust, legitimacy? How do we ensure that the constitutional design is a democratic one? Not because always it has to be democratic, but in the sense of, because there's so many schisms and divisions, we want to ensure that people accept the outcome and believe that the outcome is not preordained by one or two groups, and other groups therefore believe that they should not buy into the system. But it's also about inclusivity, about the groups such as the Kurds who have not been included, and other non-state actors. So there are a range of issues. I'll stop there. There are many things more I want to say, but I think we should open up the discussion and allow Aaron as well to make his particular introduction points. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm muted. Before Aaron presents himself, I should have introduced myself as well, and then I'll turn it over to Aaron. I'm Eric Loeb. I'm an associate professor of politics and international relations, and I focus on Middle East politics at FIU. I had the opportunity to live in Syria for a year and a half before the war to study Arabic and spend extensive time there on the ground. And so I've been following events there, not just with professional interest, but also with a personal stake in these processes and outcomes. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify my position and who I am before we turn it over to Aaron. So I'll let you take it from here, Aaron. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm a senior research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy based in DC, but I also am affiliated with the Department of Politics at Brandeis University in the Boston region. I've been following Syria going back to the beginning of the uprising in 2011. My background is mainly in jihadi groups. So when I started to see a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, which is sort of the predecessor group of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the guys who overthrew the regime more or less, I started to pay attention a lot more closely. But in that process, I also became more a student in many ways of Syria in general, because for anybody that follows Syria, you kind of have to know a lot related to it to get the broader context, to situate a lot of things due to a lot of historical processes that happen, especially with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then anything related to the complicated nature of the civil war itself over the past, 13, almost 14 years until the regime fell. And I think that's an important context when we talk about these issues. Look, we had in Syria a totalitarian regime in many respects for 50 plus years. If we're talking about human rights violations and war crimes, there's more evidence of this in Syria than we even had during the Nuremberg trials related to Nazi Germany. Obviously, I'm not comparing them, but just noting that there's more documentation related to how brutal this regime was. And it was an industrial level. And I wouldn't say every day, but a lot of days since the fall of the regime now, we've seen discovery of mass graves. And that doesn't get into all of the people that were let out of the notorious prisons following the fall of the regime, such as Sidnaya, for example. In terms of the broader context of this conversation and transitional justice, it's obviously very complicated because we had a regime that was led by a minority group, the Alawites. Obviously, not all Alawites agreed with the regime, and many of them were happy to see the fall of the regime for sure. But because they only are 8 to 10%, what have you, of the population, dealing with transitional justice is obviously very difficult because it doesn't want to appear as if they're just being picked on as a community, and that they don't have a future in the country. And it's because of the background of those that took over the country, essentially, they don't have experience related to these types of issues either. I mean, they were controlling parts of northwest Syria for 8.5 years, but they were just doing that as a sort of proto-state, but they weren't trying to enact some broader system in the way that I think many in the international community are hoping to happen. At least based off of what I have seen, there have been a number of local events that have been sponsored by the government related to transitional justice, especially in the Homs region. I think part of that might be related to that being one of the more sensitive areas with the sectarian dynamics, because there's huge minority communities, but also huge Sunni majority communities in those areas. And then there's also been events by civil society groups that have not been sponsored by the government, where people have been involved in trying to talk about these issues. But it's hard to say how much connection there is between what the government is attempting to do and what traditional society activists and organizations are attempting to accomplish. As my colleague here, Dr. Sarkin, noted, there was this national dialogue conference that occurred on February 25th. I think most outside of the cohort of HTS itself felt that the process wasn't the best. It was a bit hasty, and of course, not everybody should have been involved was involved. Stakeholders and the like, as well as different minority groups. And while the process wasn't perfect and the sort of expectation management related to it and the messaging surround it wasn't great, there were points in the final statement and document related to it that I think were encouraging and positive, and hopefully because they're stating it, they're going to have to live up to it. Otherwise, there will be disappointment in the future. But just to point out one specific quote from the final statement, which said, quote, "Achieving transitional justice by holding accountable those responsible for crimes and violations, reforming the judicial system, enacting the necessary legislation and appropriate mechanisms to ensure the achievement of justice and the restoration of rights," end quote. Obviously, that's very general, but it is something that they're speaking about and trying to at least have part of the conversation and not just completely ignoring. Obviously said it's a lot easier said than done, especially since they don't have any experience in this, and that they have to open up sort of the grouping of people that they feel that they can trust within the country that can be a part of this process, or any expertise that might come from the UN, the ICJ, as well as other, lawyers in other countries. I'll leave it at there as sort of some introductory thoughts related to this topic, but once again, thank you, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. So we're definitely going to get to transitional justice and just the process of transition more generally. But rewinding a little bit, as you both mentioned, the I mean, obviously it was Alawite by nature, but it became increasingly personalistic. The Assad regime over the last 50 years, much ink has been spilled by scholars and analysts on this phenomenon of authoritarian resilience inside and outside the Middle East, with almost overdetermination, all the variables and factors that are involved in sustaining these regimes internally and externally. And even me, myself, I had this heuristic bias, as was mentioned earlier, in terms of thinking that this regime was just going to go on in perpetuity. As was mentioned, the war breaks out in 2011 during the Arab Spring, gets into a bloody civil war. Then the tide of the conflict seems to turn in favor of, particularly after the Russian intervention in 2015, and in favor of the Assad regime and its allies in 2016. And then there's kind of this, I guess, this homeostasis or some form of kind of tenuous stability there on and off for the years that follow. But how did this regime, what are the factors internally and externally that explain how this regime could just fall so swiftly when we had, this anticipation of this bias that would be in place for so long? If either of one of you want to address that question, or both of you.
I'm happy to go. I mean, I think there's a lot of external as well as internal factors. In terms of the external factors, for one, their main patron in Russia obviously has been very focused on Ukraine going all in 2022. And then also you had the coup attempt from Prigozhin related to the Wagner Group a year or two ago now. And the Wagner Group was a key asset in fighting with the regime to claw back territory. And that was no longer the case by the time the regime fell. Plus, a lot of those assets were then redirected to Africa in their sort of stability efforts related to the Sahel region. And then when you go to one of their other allies in Iran, obviously post 10/7, Israel's response was quite substantial, not only towards Hamas in Gaza, but also we saw with Hezbollah, particularly this past August and September when they started doing a huge assassination campaign against the top leadership, as well as the walkie-talkie and beeper campaign, which took, I think, 5,000 people out of commission. And it's important to remember that when they took over a lot of the territory in Syria, those that were forces on the ground, the bulk of it was Lebanese Hezbollah, alongside some other Shia militia that were part of Iran's proxy network. But because they're so focused on the post 10/7 landscape, as well as so many people being injured or killed, there wasn't that sustainability there in terms of being able to cover the regime itself. And then in terms of the institutions of the state, I mean, as a consequence of the civil war, as well as the sanctions that were put on it, they started to look towards selling Captagon, which is a narcotic drug. And they more or less became a narco state in recent years, and therefore that kind of hollowed out a lot of the state institutions itself and created even more corruption than there was before. And also there was the financial crisis in Lebanon next door, which led to huge inflation related to the Syrian currency, and therefore people being paid by the state, it was worth nothing. And so a lot of people fled the military or just didn't decide to join again. And that's sort of on the side of the regime. And then internal to sort of HTS and what was going on there, we saw when they took over Idlib and developed their civilian governance apparatus called the Salvation Government, they did a lot of institution building. Whatever one thinks of it, since it wasn't democratic in nature, it was more sort of a soft authoritarianism. They did have a pretty robust bureaucracy, and it was meritocratic and technocratic in many ways. And then on the other side of things, following the 2020 ceasefire agreement between Turkey and Russia, which sort of created this frozen conflict scenario, they did a lot of reforms in the military, where they created a military college in December 2021, and essentially for the first time created a space where they're able to get true command and control over the different insurgent factions. Because for anybody that followed Syria knows that there was so many different insurgent groups that were fighting the regime, and they really, by the time they started the offensive at the end of November last year, were able to get this command and control. So not only was their military capabilities more robust, as well as them getting some know-how related to these kamikaze drones, but also their governance was pretty robust too. And so, at least my theory of the case is essentially that when they started going towards Aleppo, they had sort of this bespoke plan for taking over Aleppo. I don't believe that they actually thought that they're going to overthrow the regime. And so within 24 hours of taking over Aleppo, they instituted their governance apparatus. All of the different like ministries and local councils are essentially already in Aleppo. They're getting bread, waste management, water, security, electricity going again. And because people are like, all right, nothing's really changed, and this doesn't seem as bad as many people would have thought, since this is the so-called, HTS jihadis, what have you. The military is like, all right, we don't need to be here anymore. And they just started going towards Homs and Hama. And for anybody that knows Syria, that starts getting a bit more existential because it cuts off the coastal region, which is the heartland of the Alawites, to the regime. And then by then it was kind of more like when that might happen instead of if. And then, of course, you got all the southern movement getting involved, including the Druze, and that was just pretty much it. And the regime then fell in 10 days, which, I mean, I think nobody would have predicted that. And it's quite astounding. I mean, I had a feeling that the regime would fall eventually, but I was thinking maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the lines, not at this particular point. So it's even for somebody that is following it on a day-to-day basis, it was quite surprising. But yeah, so at least that's kind of how I have conceptualized what actually happened with the fall of the regime.
Can I add on, please?
Please, please.
So I think Aaron did a great job in giving all the kind of circumstantial issues which are important. Let me just add 1 or 2 points. The issue about the role of the external actors, the degradation of Lebanon and Russia and Iran are critical factors. But at the same time, there was another factor which was going the other way, and that was the acceptance of Assad and Syria back into the Arab states. And that was a counterpoint to some of those particular matters. So I'm not discounting it. I'm just adding it. That was not just a simple external kind of set of forces which played a role, because Syria was, in some senses, resurrecting its profile and being able to come back into the circumstances. I think the addition I wanted to make was particularly what was happening domestically, and how the issues of inflation and poverty and destruction, and how the will of people in the army was really undermined by the length of the war and the lack of support that they were getting from the system. The system really sold them out to such an extent where they had felt demoralized completely. And it was waiting for the spark in many ways, which eventually came, because no opposition really came from the military. In fact, the military almost went home and kind of gave up. And Assad couldn't rely anymore on the military that he had before. And that was, as Aaron had said, low wages and a range of other factors. We'd seen over the last couple of years growing dissent around particularly economic issues. And I think it's basically the economic issues which brought him down, because he could no longer bring to bear people who supported him who were benefiting economically. And it's those oligarchs who really supported him. The issue, for example, of drugs that Aaron mentioned was particularly important. Bringing his family and ensuring that people made money out of the system. When that kind of dried up, there was a lack of support for him, but particularly at the grassroots level in the military, where that really, ended the system. So I think I agree largely with what was said, with these particular additions in understanding the domestic situation, which I think was really the critical factor. The external were important, but I think the domestic scenario was probably the most important in terms of how things ended up.
Thank you for those comprehensive explanations of the fall of the Assad regime, the swift fall of it. So moving along, we're obviously talking about, and there's so much attention right now on HTS and by extension its leader, Ahmed al-Shara, who, of course, went by the nom de guerre and maybe intentionally dropped it with what's the dynamics with Israel, going by al-Jolani for a while. I mean, who is governing Syria today, or who, let's say, is in a position to govern Syria? Is it exclusively al-Shara and HTS? I mean, of course, this also will speak, as was mentioned before, to the composition of the rebel forces and even to other actors that may have been involved in the toppling of the Assad regime. So, again, is there a disproportionate focus on Ahmed al-Shara and HTS? Are other actors involved, whether they're rebels, former rebels, civil society actors, even former regime people? Yeah, and so and maybe even unpacking Ahmed al-Shara and HTS more. We've been speaking about them kind of at a surface level, but if they in fact are in charge and are really the protagonists of this process, front and center, then maybe we want to give some more context and background about them, and even what their opportunities and constraints would be governing and ruling over Syria now and moving forward.
I can start again. I mean, the group itself, like I said at the beginning, started around early 2012 as this group called Jabhat al-Nusra. At the time, it was a branch of what we now call the Islamic State. But then there was sort of a disagreement over how to deal with the other insurgent factions in the Syrian insurgency against the regime. And they more or less said that they did not want to start killing everybody like what happened in Iraq during the height of the Iraq insurgency. And so they essentially broke away when the Islamic State wanted to come into Syria themselves and kind of control what Jolani was doing at the time. But to sort of save face within their ideological milieu, they pledged allegiance to the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, at the time. But again, that didn't really go over too well, since Zawahiri sent a lot of operatives from outside of Syria that weren't Syrian and tried to control things. There was also, after the Russians invaded in 2015, this greater call for unification amongst the ranks militarily, but many people were skeptical of doing that with Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, because they were a designated terrorist group and they were still affiliated with al-Qaeda. And so for those two reasons, we kind of saw them also break ties with al-Qaeda in July 2016. Myself, as well as many others, were kind of skeptical of this just because we've seen al-Qaeda create front groups. But it's been proven over time that this was legitimate. There were ideological differences, as well as the fact that al-Qaeda then had to create a whole new branch called Hurasadin in 2018, which then subsequently Jabhat al-Nusra became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and they dismantled Hurasadin by 2020. So there is this track record of going after ISIS and al-Qaeda now, whether related to ISIS 12 years or al-Qaeda 8.5 years. And then once they did merge with a number of other insurgent factions by the summer of 2017, they then set up this civilian governance apparatus called the Salvation Government. And they, did what any government did, were doing institution building, started doing basic social services, but grew into more public works projects in the years leading up to the fall of the regime. Obviously, their past associations still kind of haunted them and people were still skeptical. But we did see more of an opening over time where they eventually stopped using their moral policing, or Hizbah, by 2021, 2022. And therefore weren't trying to push their ideas on people, but more try to convince people, as well as the fact that they started to do outreach to minorities, such as the Christians and Druze in this area, and sort of rectified some of the issues that they had previously where their properties were taken, and even allowed Christians to rebuild their churches, which, if you go like by the book of Islamic theology, technically under an Islamic regime, you're not supposed to change anything if you're not Muslim. And so that kind of where it was in some ways prior to the fall of the regime. In terms of since the fall, I mean, I think that well, Shara is definitely the face of a lot of things. The foreign minister, Asad Shibani, has been a lot of one of the key players in terms of behind the scenes and crafting a lot of what's going on. A lot of these ideas and transformations that we saw post 2016, 2017 were based off of sort of his view on how they could re-enter the international community, I guess you could say. And but even though they have been able to institute governance in the areas outside of sort of where the Syrian Democratic Forces are in northeast Syria, it's not perfect. There's more in some provinces than others. And then also there are questions about the integration of different military factions into the Ministry of Defense, which also is kind of a patchwork at this point, where some have, others haven't, and some of this relates just to power dynamics, but also others is more related to wanting to make sure that they secure their own minority rights, whether it is the potential for the SDF to integrate in the future, or related to the Druze in the South and making sure that their rights are enshrined. So I know it's a lot, but I'll leave it at that.
So let me add by saying, let me deal with, post the fall in December, and that we can say there's a limited degree of inclusivity. There's a large degree of exclusivity. And let me break that down. First of all, in terms of various ethnic groups, there's largely been exclusion of those in the broad sense in terms of their ability to affect the system. And that's certainly true of non-state actors, some of whom are still committing violence and are still engaged in the conflict, and certainly to do with the Northeast. And that is a critical issue which still needs to be resolved, because if it's not resolved, the possibilities for ongoing conflict will continue. As Aaron said correctly, involving all the militaries is crucial, both for a centralized military, but also to stop those who want to commit violence and conflict, for them to believe that they have a say and a role to play in the system. And that's where many democratic or transitional societies fail, where they don't really reach out efficiently. So, for example, you see in Colombia, although there was a peace agreement in 2016 and everybody lauds the transitional justice system, there's still conflict ongoing because some of the groups were not included. The same will be true in Syria unless there's a greater process to be inclusive. And we can learn some lessons from what's happening. As we both mentioned in the beginning, the national dialogue is a key thing where we see there was a lack of inclusivity. The process was hasty, but the question was it hasty for a reason? And that was to not involve too many people, not to allow many more people who could otherwise play a role. So people were given short notice. There was a list drafted. And in some ways, that is anti what a national dialogue is about, because national dialogues is where those groups who want to say choose their own people to participate. And that's obviously a key issue, is how does one design a system? So, for example, the president has designed the process going forward in a couple of ways. And one of those is by designating who the Constitutional Committee members are. And obviously, that's problematic to say that one person from one faction designs who the group is that designs the Constitution, because then other people are excluded from that, and there means there is no inclusive process. Even the design of the national dialogue was centered around 6 processes. Well, in some ways, that day should have been the start of a process to roll it out and to have an ongoing lengthy process, getting many people involved in the process. Now we can say, well, their security concerns, their economic concerns, and all those issues are deeply problematic. 100% we agree. But we have to look at one of the pillars of transitional justice, which is also a constitutional one, which are non-repetition, recurrences of violence. I write quite a lot about this particular area, and one thing that I can say simplistically is that almost every society where they've had conflict and violence re-enters into conflict and violence within 5 years. The numbers are between 40 and 50%. So managing the process is phenomenally important. Now, one has to do it in the context of security, and therefore you have to walk and chew gum at the same time. One cannot say, well, security concerns today, transitional justice tomorrow. And it has to be rolled out in a way that people say, oh, we buy into the process, we accept it, we're included, we have a voice in the process. And it's the same with, for example, going after people in the transitional justice process. It's not what you do, it's what you do, but also how you do it. So going after the architects of the prison systems, 150,000 or more people who disappeared and were killed, there's a need to do that. But it's a question of not going after only one group of people, going after those who were politically involved, who carried out those particular instructions. And it must be rolled out in a way which is not seen to be victor's justice. It can't be seen as targeting one group. It has to go after everybody who was involved. Now, there's a question about how extensively you do it. One can learn, from the Rwandan experience, which you go after, 150,000 people, which is obviously deeply problematic. You take your eye off many of the democratic issues. But at the same time, it needs to be done because impunity and accountability are key features of trying to do these particular processes. So it's about legitimacy, it's about trust, it's about tolerance, it's about reconciliation, it's about nation building. All those things are important, but inclusivity has to be part of it, because without part of that, the history of Syria leads us towards further conflict and further violence. So we have to understand the structural differences and the disagreements of the past, deal with those, understand why certain groups are going to feel alienated. How do we bring them back into the system? How do we build institutions that will protect minority rights, religion, language, culture, etc., and ensure people have a vehicle to have disagreements and solve those particular disagreements? So we have to have a constitutional design which brings people into that system, allow them to approve of the process, possibly have a referendum or something which gives it legitimacy, build a transitional justice as part of that process, and make sure that people accept the process. Otherwise, the possibility is that future violence is an outcome. Thank you.
Thanks. You both covered a lot of ground and touched on a lot of questions that I was going to ask. Obviously, this process of transition has a lot of moving parts and needs to be done, as you said, in a holistic fashion. And the stakes are high. As you said, Jeremy, if you don't get it right, the probabilities of recidivism or returning to conflict are very high in 5 years' time or shorter. So, thinking about the political process, as you started to touch on, and, looking at other cases, I mean, even thinking of like a case like Iraq, and I know that in the context of Syria, there's been a lot of discussion of avoiding a process of de-Baathification, where, for those of you who are not familiar, when the U.S. and its Iraqi partners basically liquidated the military and government of, former regime people wholesale, despite the years of expertise and experience they had, and even, helping fuel an insurgency. I guess, at least there's a narrative out there that this is a process that's trying to be avoided in Syria, whether it's successful or not. Maybe you could speak on it, but also on the political front, as you said, the constitution process is very important. And several weeks ago, we had another guest speaker at FIU that was debating whether Syria would embark on the path of Tunisia and have open elections for a constituent assembly, as they did in Tunisia, before sitting down to write one. And then, but it appears, based on what you said, that Syria may be following the Egyptian model, where there's an appointment process by those in power to a constituent assembly to then write it, which I guess maybe raises the risk, as you said, of an exclusionary process with the Constitution. So, maybe we could talk more about, the ghosts of de-Baathification in Syria, also the constitution writing process, more specifically. And even given that it's such a fractured country, or heterogeneous, I would say, with all these different ethnic and religious groups, if there a scenario where there could be avoided a tyranny of the majority of Sunnis, which HTS and Al-Shara ostensibly represent, or at least a subsection or segment of Sunnis in the country, and how can all of that be balanced, as well as the track record, as Aaron said, that HTS has of, if we want to call it, authoritarian light, even if it was a very specific context of the Northwest and Idlib. If somehow HTS is thinking based on what's best for Syria moving forward, but even maybe even conflicting priorities and interests of some of its external partners also. Some that may value democracy, inclusion, and human rights more, and others that may not. So perhaps you want to touch on, I know I threw a lot out there, on different aspects of the political process moving forward. And then, we could get back into security, as you said, moving forward in the next segment, which is so crucial as well to, again, if we go back to that theory, that concept of the state having the monopoly on legitimate force, how we could even get to some type of cohesive process of security sector reform and DDR, or demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. But anyway, I'll open it back to you if you want to address any of those points.
So I'll go first this time, Aaron, if that's okay with you. The de-Baathification process I'm deeply familiar with, and have written about it, and in fact did a project in Iraq on peace building, and to try and reverse the 2005 constitution process, which really wasn't a constitution process, because the Iraqi constitution in 2005 was written by the Americans. So I always talk about process, because I think how things are done, excuse me, are probably more important often than what is done. So the de-Baathification process was to basically say anybody after 2005 who was a member of the Ba'athist Party could no longer be part of the government in Iraq, which basically meant overnight you got rid of 400,000, 450,000 people in the civil service. What did those people do was to be an opposition force, because they no longer had jobs, and most of them, and more many of them, had weapons, and that created, greater conflict and violence. So one of the lessons is, I think, to do processes of lustration, as we call it, which is to change the civil service, to change the military, but to not do it too quickly, and to do it in a way which says, not all of you are rotten apples. We want to get rid of those rotten apples, and we follow a process. So we can learn, for example, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, from the Baltic states after 1990, where they went through processes of actually examine who did what, and what are the roles of particularly military people, and should those military people continue or not. And the same within the civil service as well. Some countries did private institutions. Certainly can be problematic, where you say, well, all people from a particular faction have to be dismissed. But certainly in terms of human rights violations, that's certainly a particular point. So certainly I think one of the things that was problematic when HDS came to power in December was to say we're getting rid of all the people in the military, which to some extent sets up the possibility again of repeating the Iraqi situation and in other places where you've got this change which is too quickly. You create oppositional forces who then want to ensure the state does not succeed, to ensure that you lose all the skills and experience, which is particularly vital. I'm sure in the US at the moment, you're all thinking about those particular issues. What happens in the long term about functioning bureaucracies. But that's critical in states where you want to deliver in places where you haven't had delivery, electricity, water, and all the other necessities of life. If you lose all the skills in the civil service overnight, then you will have tremendous difficulties in ensuring that those services can actually happen. There's a lot to learn from the Tunisian experience, which you mentioned, Eric, because most people had high expectations that the Tunisian system would work out very well. But in fact, while the first couple of years was very good, Truth and Reconciliation Commission presented a useful report, useful recommendations. The downfall was that the constitutional system allowed a president to come into power who was able to change the whole dynamic and ensure that the system has reversed itself. And now you have a problematic set of circumstances which have really undone the benefits of the initial transitional justice process and the transitional constitutional process. So we can learn from those particular countries to say, well, here are the lessons we should not repeat. Let's not do things too quickly. Let's do things which protect our constitution. Let's ensure that we have a pluralistic constitution which has mechanisms to ensure that minorities are included, either by having minority rights or have a federal system which guarantees decentralization with more powers to the regions, empower local societies, empower local governments, promotes civil society, ensure that you've got at least one strong, independent national human rights institution, checks and balances, separation of powers. There's a whole range of issues which are critically important. So those dynamics are particularly important as you go through a transitional period because people are looking for signs. They're looking to understand, will things go well or will things go badly? Should we vest ourselves in these particular processes? Can we benefit from these particular processes? Can we see that there's a centralization of power? And is this process being unrolled in a way which shows us that the future will be a lot better than the past? Those are critical design features. So understanding that a constitutional process is one that people will see as being protectionist for them in the future. It allocates powers. It ensures that you have either a presidential system or parliamentary system. But at the same time, power cannot be corrupted. And there are processes to ensure that if people do things which are problematic, they can be reined back. There are many things we could talk about in those particular sentiments. But alongside those are a range of other issues that need to be solved. And one of the things is particularly important, and we haven't mentioned it so far, is how do we ensure that the international community invests in the process for them to ensure that they see the future in terms of a rollout which guarantees human rights and a range of other issues, because investors will want to see stability, will want to see that what happens is a place that they can ensure that whatever they do, there's an outcome which will not be affected by conflict and violence. So the system, I think, in Syria has a lot to learn from the region, but also I think from the wider international developments around constitutional design, around transitional justice systems, etc. There's a lot that can be learned from Morocco, from a range of other places in the region, specifically in terms of what can be done, not to undermine the future and to ensure that a lot of things can be done to benefit people, particularly to ensure that they don't want to do what happened in Iraq, which was to undermine the system and continue with conflict. And for me, one of the central questions is about protection of minorities, inclusion, ensuring that they have a seat at the table, that they can participate. That is not just, semblance of participation, but it's real participation. And it's not a sense of we being directed again, as happened during the Assad years. How can we ensure that the system, in fact, guarantees that the outcome is better? And these are questions I'm sure that millions of Syrians who are outside the country are looking at to determine when should they return. Many do want to return, but the question is, Am I going to return yet? Am I going to help to rebuild the society? And I think those are critical questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just to add, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been looking at as somebody that's kind of looked at the history of HTS is that they did sort of have an initial, creation of a different government already with the Salvation Government, and that was sort of this stage managed process from sort of the spring of 2017 through the fall winter 2017, where they weren't necessarily out front, but they, had local activists, academics, notables, what have you, being involved in setting up, conferences to suggest certain things. But essentially, it was being marionetted from behind the scenes, more or less. And this process that we've seen now over the last 3 months, especially in light of the preparatory committee and then the actual National Dialogue Conference, that they have this plan behind the scenes. They don't really articulate it publicly. There aren't expectations created. And therefore, there's a lot of confusion, but then try and have pushing it through quickly. Unlike with the Salvation Government, at least there are women involved now, as well as there are minority groups, even if it's maybe not in an ideal sense that many would hope for. So it's definitely more inclusive in that sense, but from their perspective, they just want people to do it in an individual capacity and not as a specific block or group. And I think part of that is that way, at least some people view it, as they can control the process more easily instead of it being tied to a union or a political party or anything else. Related to the question of debathification, my colleague here obviously talked about the military angle of it, but at least within the bureaucracy of the different ministries, nobody has been let go unless it's related to ghost employees, or they've set certain benchmarks related to employment, and that has been the sort of reasons for that are the same, no matter whether you're Sunni, Alawite, Druze, Christian, what have you. So it's not like they're being discriminatory in that relation. So at least within the bureaucracy itself, my understanding is that it's pretty much intact. And because of that, there are many, minority groups that continue to be part of the ministries and working every day, since many of them were part of obviously the Assad regime. And beyond sort of at that executive or national level, when you look at the district level too, most of the people that are running sort of the local governance, it's pretty much the same people as before. There might be some appointed person related to HTS to kind of oversee what's going on, but in terms of just like the day-to-day nuts and bolts, it's still being done by the same people. So even if there's the complication related to the military aspect in terms of the day-to-day interface of the government, there at least is that positive. But when we do get into the military stuff, we have seen that some remnants of the regime have been trying to reorganize, and it's slowly building up. I don't know if you'd call it an insurgency yet or not, but you do see assassination attempts at different checkpoints or kidnappings, and they're sort of reformulating themselves as the Syrian National Resistance, which, makes sense when sort of how things were kind of set up or framed previously within the broader, axis of resistance, I guess you could say. Not to say that Iran is involved in this or not. I don't think we have good enough information to know the extent of it just being a local initiative, I guess you could say, or if Iran is trying to be a spoiler. But the fact that we have started to see more of that more recently is obviously not a good sign for the future.
Well, again, thank you for your insightful remarks. I could spend hours speaking with you, but I know we have time constraints. So in the last few minutes, I'll throw a couple of questions out there. Feel free to address one or both of them, before we wrap up. On the front of transitional justice, right? One of the things we didn't mention yet is that one of the things that's appeared in scholarly and even media analysis of Syria is these reconciliation centers. that have been established in Syria. And is there any traction to these centers? And is there a way, as we've mentioned before today, for there to be a healthy balance or a constructive balance between retribution of those who have perpetuated human rights violations? I mean, just today, again, there's reports that it's not just in the prisons of Saydnaya and elsewhere, but even in people's basements where they're finding dead bodies right now and mass graves. Is there a way to balance retribution with reconciliation? And are the reconciliation centers in Syria a good start to that process? Secondly, we didn't talk about, I mean, we did a little bit in terms of the economic grievances that people had inside and outside the military, excuse me, leading up to the fall of the Assad regime. What about the economic outlook now? Obviously, one of the big topics is sanctions relief. We know that HTS has been sanctioned by the United States, international community, and that there's talks of alleviating sanctions against them so that they could have them, do their jobs more effectively, essentially, in providing security, governance, and transitional justice. And then, is there talks even on the economic front of an international effort, either regionally or beyond, of providing foreign aid, of development assistance, even a reconstruction process, facilitating investment from the Syrian diaspora and elsewhere. So I'll just leave it at that. If you have any final thoughts about transitional justice and about the economic outlook of Syria moving forward.
I mean, to put it blunt, it's pretty dire. 90% of the country's in poverty. 1/3 of the buildings are either destroyed or hollowed out. And that's before you even are able to do reconstruction. You have to remove all that rubble. And even though the EU has lifted some sanctions in different sectors, it still doesn't have the same weight or heft as US sanctions, which were originally put on the Assad state, not this new government.
All right.
But in my conversations with folks here in DC, there's a lot of reticence to do anything until they see the new government in Syria show that they're willing to, have this transition in a way that would be deemed acceptable in the eyes of sort of U.S. interests, I guess you could say. And so there's kind of this chicken and egg issue where I think people in Damascus want to do things, but they need the sanctions to be lifted first, whereas the U.S. is kind of like, well, we want you to show us certain things so that when we feel comfortable taking off sanctions. So it's not good.
Let me focus more on the transitional justice side. And there's some positive features in the sense that there was a meeting between the president and families of the missing. There've been a range of other transitional justice conferences. One negative sign, there was a conference that I think it was organized by a group of lawyers that was banned and was not allowed to continue. So the question that one must ask is, to what extent is their commitment to free speech and political participation, et cetera, Certainly, whatever transitional justice process is rolled out has to have various component parts. We've talked about the accountability part, and obviously the question is how many people, to what extent, with the international community, non-victors justice, etc. That particular part, I think there's a clarity that there will be accountability. The question is against whom and for what, going after serious crimes, etc. But at the same time, this notion of reconciliation cannot only be a transitional justice issue. It has to be a national issue. So I always talk about reconciliation in layers. There has to be, national reconciliation. There has to be community reconciliation. There has to be group reconciliation. There has to be reconciliation between the Northeast and the rest of the country, et cetera, But it has to be built also into the way you do things around the constitutional design, because that promotes the idea of tolerance and respect and inclusivity, et cetera. Linked to that also is non-repetition. How do you ensure that people don't want to commit violence and conflict? And that's by bringing them into the constitutional system. So part of transitional justice has to ensure that people won't commit violence and conflict in the future, and that is by including them in the broader system. We also have to talk about reparations and questions of rebuilding. And that may be part of the system to ensure that accountability is also accountability through means to ensure that the issues that Aaron was talking about, the destruction of cities can be built up, finding all the money that was looted, finding all the family members who were able to benefit through the drugs and all the other things, and getting them to pay for a lot of the things which is particularly important. And that's linked to the economic issues. Unless, the international community see that there's a movement towards transitional justice, there's a movement towards stability, there's a movement towards minority protection, human rights, then the investment won't come. It will come, and issues of ending sanctions and whatever will come about once the signs are more positive in terms of the direction. We haven't talked about certainly the one issue about what is the president's own particular background. Is he an ideologue, or is he a person who seeks to gain power? And I think that's a really interesting question, because in some ways it sets the scene for where Syria is going. My own position is, I think, and this is based on the reading I've done, he's more interested, because he's a chameleon and he's changed his circumstances over time. We can see that the ideology and the issues that people have difficulties with are less important than where he sits in terms of the power structure. So that might be useful in terms of reaching out and ensuring that what he does is limited, or let's say controlled by, better understanding about when, the strings can be pulled or released by certain actors, both domestically but also internationally. But I think critically, these issues come together. So transitional justice and economics and the constitutional systems are intricately interlinked and should be seen together. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. As you said, this is a holistic process with multiple moving parts. I can't thank you both enough for really this informative and rich discussion. I've certainly benefited a great deal from it, and I hope that our viewers and listeners have as well. Again, can't thank you both enough for joining us. We're just a few minutes after 12, so I think we did our jobs well, despite the occupational hazards of being scholars, academics. We're able to complete this session on time. And hopefully we'll be able to continue the discussion down the road just as events continue to unfold in this geopolitically important part of the world. So thanks again, and hope we can keep in touch.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I guess the tech people will take it from here.